Ironically, what began as a secret society on the island where my own parents, grandparents, great grandparents have immigrated from has penetrated every aspect of American pop culture. From movies, The Godfather, Goodfellas, to iconic television programs, Wise Guy, The Sopranos, to historical events, the Kennedy assassination, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The life has penetrated every aspect of American society. Oh, the irony. Beginning as a secret society and now the subject of the most popular podcasts, like my new podcast here with Bullet Bob Carson, Mob Chats. And we are honored to welcome a man today who is the foremost authority on Cosa Nostra history, on mob history. Reporter, author, icon, George Anastasia. How are you, George?
Very well, Matt. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, George. And I just want to pass this on to Bob because I know Bob has a number of questions for you, and then I'll come in kind of at the end. So, Bob, the floor is yours.
George, I'm really excited to have you here. I'm not exaggerating when I say that you are considered one of the most foremost experts in the mafia, at least in terms of people who haven't actually been members. But seriously, for us to be able to have you here is really, really an honor. I appreciate your time. Before we talk about this in more detail, I wanted to give people an idea about your early life. How would you describe your childhood? How would you describe your parents if you were born in Philadelphia and you ended up moving to New Jersey, as I understand it?
Yeah, I was born in South Philadelphia, which is the Italian-American community, and my mother and father were both from South Philly. We migrated to South Jersey when I was 4 years old, so I basically grew up about 20 miles outside the city. And the mafia was, I guess, something I was always fascinated with. I didn't know very much about it, but whenever we visited relatives, you would see certain guys around the neighborhood that, you knew they didn't have a 9-to-5 job. How I got involved in writing about it, though, I became a reporter in the Philadelphia Inquirer sent me to Atlantic City to cover the beginning of casino gambling back in 1976. And part of the political debate back then was, is legalized gambling going to bring the mob to Atlantic City? The answer was the mob already was in Atlantic City. But as I started covering that industry, I also started writing about the mob. So that's the thumbnail sketch of how I ended up doing and being what I am. I became first the Atlantic City reporter for the Inquirer and eventually segued into being the mob writer for the Inquirer. And I was very fortunate that I was working for the Inquirer at a time when newspapers were really popping. They had a lot of resources, and I was able to kind of carve out a niche and a beat. It would be difficult to do that today, given the financial constraints that newspapers are dealing with. But I came at a good time.
Yeah, my understanding is that you were, as a high schooler, you were a student athlete. You were a football player, good enough to be recruited by multiple schools, and you ended up going to Dartmouth, correct?
No, that's correct. Yeah, I played football and baseball. Looking back now, I got grandkids. They play soccer. I wish I had been able to play soccer. Nobody played soccer when I was a kid. I think it's a much better sport than football. But yeah, I ended up going to Dartmouth, and it's a funny story with that. I mean, I'm the first one in my family to go to college. God bless my parents. They just said, yeah, do what you got to do. So I go to Dartmouth, and I don't know if you know the movie Animal House. The guys that wrote the screenplay for Animal House were 2 years ahead of me. And Farber College in the movie was basically based on Dartmouth, except that it was not co-ed. So I spent a semester in France just to get out of New Hampshire, it snows in October. You don't see the ground again until May. So I spent a semester in France for foreign study. And when I went back, I said to my advisor, I'd like to do that again. And he said to me, well, we only have one program. So the only way you could go a second time is independent study. And the only way you can do independent study is if you major in French. So I said, all right, I'll be a French major. And as I said, my parents, they didn't say, what the hell are you going to do with a degree in French? They just said, yeah, go do it. So I spent 2 semesters in France. And that's where I got fascinated with the newspaper business, because this was, 1960s. There's no internet. You can't call home. It's expensive. I used to read the International Herald Tribune every day. And I got fascinated with newspapers at that point. And when I got out, I got a job at a small newspaper and worked my way up to the Inquirer.
And you progressed pretty rapidly at the newspapers. I mean, in terms of your writing and promotion. What do you attribute to your success? I mean, you seem to be someone who's pretty open-minded person. You seem to be pretty intelligent, pretty diligent about your work.
Well, I think one of the things with going to Dartmouth, what I learned at Dartmouth was you learn how to learn. And for a reporter, that's the key. I mean, every day is a different story. Every day is, you're looking at something different, and you got to be a pretty quick study. So I was able to, I think, progress because I had that ability. And originally, the first newspaper I worked at, a small paper in Woodbury, New Jersey, I was hired as a sports writer. And I knew sports because I had played sports. So that's kind of was my journalism school, a small paper writing about sports and then segued into news. So I was able to build, I learned how to do it. And then when the opportunity came along and I was in Atlantic City, a lot of things opened up for me. And then while I'm covering the mob and the casinos and the mob in Atlantic City, Angelo Bruno, the longtime mob boss in Philadelphia, he gets killed. And then things start to careen way out of control. And then I'm kind of riding that wave.
Yeah, I know you covered the Angelo Bruno murder in detail. I know you faced some criticism and skepticism of reporting on the mafia over the years. It seems like, people think mafioso only kill each other and that they don't have a direct impact on the average person.
Yeah, that's kind of the attitude. They don't bother me. I don't bother them. They only kill one another. And that isn't the case. I mean, what I've seen, what I've learned from covering all of this is they have an impact on us in a lot of different ways. Simple things like what a can of olive oil costs in a supermarket if they're controlling certain industries, what a slice of pizza costs. They're big in the trash business. I mean, the environmental impact of mob-run companies that disregard environmental concerns and dump all kind of crap in the landfill. We pay a price constantly for all of that. And those are the things you got to be aware of. It's more than just, wise guys shooting one another. The real key, I had a guy in North Jersey tell me this, and it's crucial. I teach a course on organized crime. He said to me, what you have to understand is vice is commerce. Any way we can make money, that's what we're about. And mostly it's vice. It's gambling, it's loan sharking, it's narcotics, it's profits. But it's, for me, he says, it's commerce. It's a way to make money. I don't have any kind of moral compunction, moral judgments. It's a business. And so that's the thing I think people have to be aware of when they're talking about or looking at wise guys, it's Don Corleone and it's almost romantic. It's not. It's not. By and large, these guys are thugs. And by and large, it's the bottom line. It's about making money.
You had a really interesting quote for an NPR interview that I thought summed it up pretty good. You said, when they impact on society, whether it's construction or the control of the price of cheese or trash collection, those are things we have to care about. And they're always reaching out and trying to get their hands in that kind of stuff. You kind of went into it, a little bit there, but can you give us a little bit more detail about, how this exists today? I mean, what sort of ways has organized crime impacted the lives of people in the city, particularly in today's climate?
Yeah, one of the things that I saw in Atlantic City with the casino industry is all the ancillary services, the laundry, the trash hauling, supplying the meats, the food products, controlling controlling labor unions. In Atlantic City, it was the bartenders union, but across the country, it's the Teamsters, the longshoremen, the laborers. All of those different ways we pay. Here's an example. Nick Caramondi, the guy who wrote the first book about Blood and Honor in Philadelphia, the Benjamin Franklin Hotel had been closed for many years, and it was going to be rebuilt, gutted and rebuilt as a condominium project. And they had to gut the building. And the contractor didn't want to pay the going rate for labor, unionized labor guys, because it would be expensive and you got to pay the health care and you got to pay this. So Caramondi basically bribed the president of the laborers union. I think he gave him 30 grand and 2 kilos of coke. And basically the laborers union agreed, we won't get involved in that job. That's a non-union job. So now Caramondi goes down into South Philadelphia in his neighborhood and he says, I got jobs. You got a kid that needs a job, I can get him work. So now he gets 20, 25 kids who are out of work and they work gutting the Benjamin Franklin Hotel, pulling out all the asbestos. Now they don't have the proper equipment. God knows what they're breathing in. They're not getting paid union rates, but the contractor is happy to have him because he's paying less money to get the job done. And Caramondi's a hero in the neighborhood because he's provided jobs for kids who didn't have jobs. I mean, that's the kind of stuff. That's just one small example. But, you know, when Nick told me that story, I said, you know, this is what it's really about. He's a hero in the neighborhood for providing jobs for kids who are pulling asbestos out without the proper coverage. And God knows what's going to happen to them 20 years down the road. But in the immediate instance, that's the way it worked. And that's what the mob does. I mean, it just takes advantage of any and every opportunity.
I'd like to talk about a book of yours called Gotti's Rules, which I've listened to twice on Amazon Audible, and the various personalities that are involved. I recommend to everybody. I recently did a book review of this. Fans of the Mob Chat show will know that you know I've been advocating everyone to read this book, which I really enjoyed. I'll probably listen to it for a third time. But let's talk about how you got started on the Gotti's Rules project. Was that something that you initiated personally, or were you approached to work on it?
I'm laughing because it's a fascinating story, but there's still a lot of bad blood in all of this. No, I was still at the Inquirer, and I got a phone call from someone who said John A. Light would like to speak to you. And John A. Light is the protagonist of the book Gotti's Rules. He was an associate. He's Albanian, so he could never be a made guy. And he contacted me and began to tell me his story. Now, I put together the story, and again, it's subjective rather than objective. So I'm telling his story from his perspective. That's what it's about. And it was his view of what he did for the Gambino organization, for John Gotti Sr., and more importantly, for John Gotti Jr., and the relationship between him and John Gotti Jr. And that's what the book is really about. And it's about, I guess the bottom line is John Gotti Sr. and John Gotti Jr. drove the Gambino family into the ground because it wasn't about being a leader. It was about being a boss and grabbing money with both fists. And however you needed to do it, you did it, and the hell with everybody else. Well, I mean, Gotti Jr., who's still out there, one, didn't like A. Light because A. Light ended up testifying against him, and two, he didn't like me. So there's been an ongoing online verbal sparring match since that book came out. But to me, it was an opportunity to write about New York. I mean, I've written extensively about Philadelphia, and quite frankly, selling a book about Philadelphia to a New York publisher is always a hard sell. Selling a book about John Gotti to a New York publisher, they already know. They know who he is. They know the value of the book. So it was easier to get a book deal. And then it was just a question of, presenting. I think John A. Light is one of the more fascinating wise guys I've ever met. A lot of people don't like him. Other people say he's a genuine tough guy. And, he didn't get along with the Gottis at the end, but what he's saying is what it was like. So it's a book that it still generates interest and still generates controversy, but it's a book that I'm proud of it. And I think it tells a story of John Gotti Sr. that you don't see from the mythology that comes out from the Gotti camp, and from the Gotti movie with John Travolta and the Gotti movie with Armand Assante. John Gotti Sr. was not this mythical heroic figure that he's portrayed as. John Gotti Sr. was a gangster and a thug, and drove that crime family into the ground.
What were your impressions of John A. Light? And as you came to reach or research him further, did your impressions change of him?
Yeah, John A. Light. When I began to sit down with him, we sat down, oh my God, I don't know, a couple dozen times over breakfast at a diner in Marlton, New Jersey. And the one thing I said to him was, John, listen, John, don't make anything up. And you don't have to lie. This story in and of itself, is going to work. It's a great, great story. And I said, the only thing I'm asking you is not to lie. Now, I talked to prosecutors. I reviewed all his trial testimony to make sure everything kind of fell in line and sync. The Gottis would quibble with some of that, but by and large, I mean, I believed the story and I presented it. I think, Light was a really good athlete. he was recruited to play baseball at the University of Tampa. And then I think he got Tommy John, his elbow popped and he couldn't play anymore. And so he came back to New York. And I think what happened with John A. Light was the energy and the drive that made him a good athlete. He took that and used it in the underworld. And he had that same energy, that same drive, that the same desire to succeed. Now it's a distorted kind of work ethos, but I think that's what happened. And he became a major player in the Gambino organization. The Gambinos done well, no, he just was a hanger-on guy. Well, John Gotti Jr. was the best man at A. Light's wedding, and A. Light was a groomsman at Vicky Gotti's wedding. So if he's just a hang-around guy, how's that happen? You know?
Yeah.
The other thing that bothers John Gotti Jr. extensively is he sat down with the FBI and tried to cut a deal. And the New York papers had written about this when it happened. And I basically, in the book, present the FBI memo of that meeting. And Junior now is trying to spin it that, well, I sat down with them, but I was never really going to cooperate. And I just wanted to know what they knew and blah, 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 blah. If you read that memo, which is, I think, 5 pages long, he threw a lot of people under the bus. And now he's trying to say, oh, no, I wasn't really going to cooperate. You know, I don't know why that deal didn't work out. Maybe he did back away, or maybe the FBI decided we can't make a deal with John Gotti Jr. because of who he is. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know he did sit down and he made the offer. And here's the irony about it. Subsequent to that, in the last couple of years, he's been talking about doing a documentary called WITSEC Mafia, Witness Security Program Mafia. All the guys that went into WITSEC, A. Light being one of them, and then Sammy Gravano, and there's a host of guys. And the irony to me is, if Gotti Jr.'s proffer session had been accepted, he could have been the boss of the WITSEC Mafia. You know, he doesn't want to hear that, but that's the reality. And all the other spin that he puts out there, you got to keep coming back to that. He sat down with the FBI. He was trying to cut a deal. He's calling A. Light a rat. A. Light makes no bones about what he was and what he did. He said, look, I did all these things. I beat people up. I murdered people. I was a rotten individual. And I also testified I was a rat. But he said, you know, they were ready to throw me under the bus, and that was my only alternative. He spent 2 years in a prison in Brazil, one of the most horrific prisons in the world.
Yeah.
And
Ari
so,
Franco.
yeah. So, I mean, that's part of the book as well. He's a fascinating guy. I mean, and he continues to market himself. There's a whole thing going on, as you guys well know. These guys, Gravano, Michael Franzese, Bobby Luisi up in Boston, John A. Light, they found that they don't need somebody like me anymore. They don't need a middleman. They can just get this social media provides them with a platform. They can get out there and start telling their story whenever, however, and to whomever they want. And that's what's going on. And it's changed the whole dynamic, I think.
What do you think of the Gotti family in terms of how they stack up against other criminal enterprises and families?
I mean, I think the bottom line in New York, if you want to look contemporaneously, look at the Genovese family and look at the Gambino family. Look at Vincent Gigante and look at John Gotti Sr. You know, who knew how to run an organization? It's a difference between, I think, being a boss and being a leader. There's a difference, you know, and I think John Gotti Sr. liked to be the boss. I don't know that he knew how to be a leader. And as a result, I think he drove his organization into the ground.
You know, as you mentioned, A. Light and Gotti Jr. makes note of this. You know, A. Light wasn't used in a lot of prosecutions. We hear about the main criticism against A. Light is his believability. The juries didn't believe his version of events. You know, it seems that the Gottis and other families have leaned on the fact repeatedly over and over to try to discredit him, and by extension, discredit the Gotti's rules book. Why do you think the jury may have disbelieved him, and what forces were at work, if any, during the trial?
Oh yeah, I mean, you got to remember, Gotti Jr. was on trial 3 times before that trial with the Curtis Sliwa assault case. So, and those ended in hung juries. I think A. Light was a dangerous individual, and he presented himself on the jury as a dangerous individual. And I guess it comes down to, is a juror going to convict somebody based on that kind of testimony? Now, he testified at another trial against another mobster and ended up with a conviction. In the Gotti Jr. trial, depending on whose statistics you get, the jury was split 7-5 and 8-4, I think, on different counts to convict. So he convinced some of the jurors, but not all of the jurors. And it's a hung jury is not an acquittal. A hung jury is we couldn't decide. And the prosecution, after trying Gotti Jr. 3 times in the Curtis Lewa case, and the 4th time with Gotti, decided we're not going to do it again. Here's the other interesting thing, and it's funny how the legal system works. That indictment was originally brought in Tampa, Florida. And Gotti's lawyers rightly argued most of the events revolve around New York. The trial should be in New York. That's the venue. I believe if that trial had occurred in Tampa, it might have had a different outcome. Different jury, different people have a different concept. We're talking about a New York, basically New York metropolitan jury. The Gotti name carries a lot of weight. So there's a lot of different factors come into play. We could argue forever about what that all means. John A. Light stands behind what he said. Federal prosecutors and FBI agents who investigated it said he was the real deal. Now, he didn't get a conviction in that case. It happens. Stuff happens.
Yeah, I mean, he came across. I thought he was credible. Like you said, comes across as noble in that world, a genuine tough guy and whatnot. But again, the Gottis have their people. A lot of people say, "Oh, he's embellishing or inventing these stories." Before we move on, what would you say to those people that say that John A. Light's embellishing or fabricating some of these stories?
One, it's difficult to prove whether he is or he isn't. I accept that, but I'm looking at a guy who basically put his life on the line out on the streets, and then again put his life on his line when he decided to cooperate. And he was vetted by federal prosecutors and vetted by FBI agents who certainly were in that world and knew of that world. And it's no small thing to take a guy and put him up on the witness stand and say, I believe in what he's saying. I mean, there